In 1820, in the shipyards of Boston, Massachusetts, a sleek new vessel slid into the waters of the harbor. Its name, Theophilus Chase. To the world, it was yet another commercial schooner, its hull well crafted, sails stitched with precision, copper fastenings polished bright by shipwright's labor. To the men who built it, it represented promise, of trade, of wealth, of voyages to faraway coasts. But hidden beneath its whitewashed decks was a crueler purpose. I'm truly glad to welcome you to the Glorious Historian channel. Tell us in the comments, from which country are you watching us? Like this video if this content speaks to you, and subscribe to our channel to get notified about new releases. Enjoy watching, your presence here matters. Theophilus Chase was built not just for speed or distance, but for capacity. Its underdeck was unusually broad, with rows of fixed wooden bars and reinforced iron rings bolted into the floor. Its belly was wide and low, not for cargo, but for captives. Though slavery had been outlawed by the U.S. in 1808, illegal slave voyages continued in secret. The ship's design whispered what could not be spoken openly: this was a vessel of human trafficking. The ship's captain, Nathaniel Rook, was a veteran of transatlantic voyages. Once a merchant, he had become something darker, a smuggler of stolen lives. Under the cover of West Indies trade licenses, he had already made 3 such crossings, carrying chained Africans from the coast of Sierra Leone to the sugar fields of Cuba. Now, with Theophilus Chase, he planned something larger. More cargo. More risk. More profit. Its maiden voyage was planned in whispers and shadows. Paperwork was falsified. Barrels were loaded, not just with salted pork and fresh water, but iron shackles and preserved limes to ward off scurvy. 27 crew members signed on. Most knew what lay ahead. Some didn't care. A few kept silent and looked away. On April 12, 1821, the ship left Boston under a false manifest. The sun was bright and the sea calm. To the casual observer, it was a merchant vessel headed to the Caribbean. But the wind in its sails carried darker intentions. By the time Theophilus Chase reached the coast of West Africa, nearly 6 weeks later, its fate, and the fate of hundreds of Africans, had already been sealed. By late May 1821, Theophilus Chase reached the shores of West Africa, anchoring near the Sierra Leone coast under cover of a light fog. The local terrain was lush and deceptive, dense mangrove swamps giving way to villages nestled beneath canopies of palms. To the villagers, foreign ships were a common, if unwelcome, sight. But many had learned to fear vessels like this one. On board, Captain Rook and his officers met with a local trader, a middleman who worked in the shadows between African rulers, raiding parties, and European slavers. He was dressed in worn robes, his teeth filed to sharp points, a practice common among his people. They spoke in broken Portuguese and English, discussing quantities, how many captives could be secured, how long it would take, and what would be exchanged. In this case, muskets, iron tools, mirrors, and rum. The process of acquiring slaves was brutal and swift. Armed men from inland kingdoms, some coerced by threats, others motivated by greed or survival, raided nearby villages at night. Entire families were torn apart, children ripped from mothers, elders left behind to weep in silence. Survivors were marched in chains to the coast, often traveling for days with little food or water, exposed to the elements. Many died along the way. When they finally arrived at the beach, the captives were weak, afraid, and confused. Their wrists and ankles were rubbed raw from bindings. They were stripped of possessions and dignity. Some still wore fragments of tribal dress, beads, cloth, or carved symbols, but much was torn or taken. They were lined up and inspected like cattle. Captain Rook took notes as his first mate examined each captive. Teeth were checked, muscles prodded. Anyone sick, elderly, or disfigured was rejected or sent to die in holding pens along the shore. The rest, young, strong, mostly between the ages of 10 and 30, were approved for loading. Loading began at night to avoid British patrols that still occasionally enforced anti-slavery laws. The captives were rowed in small groups from the shore to Theophilus Chase, forced to climb rope ladders or be lifted by nets. Once aboard, they were herded below deck, into a narrow, airless hold already prepared with rows of wooden planks and rusting chains. Men were separated from women and children. They were packed shoulder to shoulder in darkness, with barely enough space to sit, let alone lie down. Buckets were placed for waste. There were no windows, no ventilation, only the stench of sweat, fear, and despair. Some screamed. Others prayed. A few were silent, already broken by the journey. Above deck, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. Chains rattled in the dark. Orders were barked. The moon hid behind clouds, as if unwilling to bear witness. By the end of the second night, over 200 human beings had been loaded onto Theophilus Chase. The ship was no longer just wood and sail, it was a floating prison. The belly of Theophilus Chase became a tomb even before it left the coast. The hold, about 5 feet high, forced most captives to crouch or sit hunched for hours. Dozens of men were chained in rows on bare wooden planks slick with sweat and seawater. The women, held separately, had slightly more space, but that small mercy came at a cost. Guards patrolled constantly, and abuse was frequent. Some women were dragged above deck in the dead of night and returned in silence, clothes torn, eyes empty. The stench of the hold was overpowering. With over 200 bodies crammed below, and almost no ventilation, the air turned thick and sour. Buckets for waste overflowed within hours. Rats skittered across the beams. Flies buzzed at wounds left untreated. Lice burrowed under cloth and skin. The groaning of the ship was joined by the groans of the dying. For food, each captive received a few handfuls of boiled beans or rice once a day. Water came from iron buckets passed hand to hand, spilling more than it quenched. Many were too weak to lift their heads. Some refused to eat at all. Others whispered prayers in unfamiliar languages, calling on gods who could not follow them across the sea. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery and fever took hold first. Those who fell ill were unshackled and moved to a corner to die quietly. Corpses were removed only when the smell became too much. Each morning, hatches opened and daylight flooded in. That was the only time most saw the sun, and only so the crew could count the living. Up on deck, sailors moved with clinical detachment. Some had been on slaving voyages before and no longer flinched at screams or blood. Others vomited over the rail. A few young sailors, new to this kind of work, had stopped speaking entirely. Still, they followed orders. Every few days, the captives were forced above deck in groups, marched in chains for a few minutes to exercise. It was not for their benefit, it was to keep them barely strong enough to survive the journey. Whips cracked if anyone fell. Some stared out at the endless sea, their faces unreadable. Others wept. No one spoke. One woman, likely no older than 17, sang softly while cradling a younger child, her brother, perhaps, or her own. Her song was a lullaby from the men people. Though the guards jeered and mocked her, she continued, her voice steady even as her body trembled. These moments, brief as they were, became small acts of defiance. In the face of despair, memory and song endured. Even in chains, even in the dark, even starving, resistance never truly died aboard Theophilus Chase. It began with whispers. In the hold, captives from different tribes tried to find a shared language, some using gestures, others speaking broken words of Akan, Yoruba, or Mend. Among the men was an older figure, missing 2 front teeth, a sign of initiation in his homeland, and he took on a quiet leadership. His voice was low, barely audible over the groaning ship. But he spoke of timing, of signals, of the few moments when guards were distracted. One night, a fight broke out below deck, not between captives, but against a crewman who had descended to punish a young boy for crying. Someone struck him with a broken chain hook, tearing open his scalp. The crewman screamed, and chaos erupted. Before others could react, the captives had been beaten back, several shot through the grates above. The boy died. So did 3 others. In retaliation, the captain ordered a public punishment. At midday, the ship stopped. Sailors pulled a group of men and 1 woman onto the deck, their wrists bound. Before the crew and the other captives, lined up and forced to watch, the condemned were flogged with braided whips dipped in salt water. The sound of leather on flesh cracked louder than the waves. The woman did not scream until the 10th strike. The others bled silently. Then came the real message. One of the men, still breathing, was tied to a cannon and thrown overboard. The splash was followed by silence. After that, resistance changed. It became quieter. Subtle. Acts of defiance were hidden in gesture, a foot pressed against a weak plank, a message scratched with a fingernail into wood, a lullaby hummed in a forbidden tongue. Some captives refused to eat, hoping to die on their own terms. Others tried to strangle themselves with their own chains. The crew, increasingly nervous, doubled guard rotations. The hold was searched daily. Water was rationed even more. The first mate began carrying pistols at all times, and the cook, once half-drunk and jovial, now refused to go below deck at all. And yet, hope lingered like a shadow. There were rumors that a British patrol ship had been spotted weeks earlier near the coast. Some believed they might be rescued. Others believed rescue was death. Either way, the idea of freedom, however distant, lit a spark that could not be fully extinguished. Above all, the ship itself seemed to creak louder with every mile. The hull moaned in protest. Ropes snapped more easily. The sea had not forgotten what kind of vessel Theophilus Chase had become. The storm began as a low grumble in the west, barely noticeable over the wind and water. But by nightfall, Theophilus Chase was swallowed by black clouds and boiling seas. Lightning danced across the sky, revealing the silhouette of the ship as it heaved against towering waves. Rain fell in sheets. Sails were ripped from their lines. The mainmast groaned, threatening to snap. Crew members shouted into the void, their voices lost to thunder. A sailor was thrown overboard by a sudden gust and vanished into darkness. Below deck, panic turned to terror. The hold tilted violently with every wave. Chains scraped wood and bone as bodies were tossed side to side. Water rushed in from seams, pooling beneath the planks. Some captives screamed. Others prayed. A few stayed eerily still, either too weak or resigned to fate. Buckets and food barrels rolled freely. Rats fled upward, sensing something the humans couldn't. The air, already foul, thickened further with the stench of sickness and seawater. A young boy, already feverish, began convulsing. His mother held him tightly, shielding him as best she could from the crashing and shifting chaos around them. On deck, the captain barked orders, his soaked hat plastered to his head. He swore through his teeth as a sail snapped in half and the rigging tore free. Lightning struck the bow, splintering the railing. Sparks fell onto the wet boards. The helmsman fought to keep the wheel straight as the ship pitched nearly sideways. The ocean poured across the deck like a living thing, hungry and wild. The ship listed hard to port. Barrels smashed against the railings. A cannon broke loose and crushed a sailor's leg. His scream barely rose above the storm. Another wave crashed over the stern, taking with it 2 more crewmen. At the height of the storm, a miracle, or a curse, occurred. A section of the hatch above the hold broke free. Rain poured directly into the space below, drenching the captives, loosening some chains from the soaked and splintered wood. For a few breathless moments, a sliver of open sky could be seen from within the darkness. Some captives raised their faces to the rain, mouths open, desperate for water or salvation. Others whispered that it was a sign, either from their ancestors or from the sea gods of their homeland. For the first time in weeks, the smell of salt water overwhelmed the stench of confinement. But the storm showed no mercy. The sliver of sky was quickly shuttered by the crew. The hold returned to darkness. And above, Theophilus Chase drifted into the abyss of the Atlantic, damaged but afloat. Days after the storm, a new threat spread silently through the hold: disease. It began with coughs. Dry at first, then wet and rattling. The fever came next. Sweat-soaked skin, rapid breathing, eyes glazed with confusion. The close, rotting air below deck was already thick with filth and waste, and now it carried the scent of sickness. The young and the old fell first. Children whimpered quietly until they stopped moving altogether. An elder woman with facial scars of her homeland passed away in her sleep, her lips still whispering a prayer no one understood. The sailors noticed quickly. They called it ship fever, a mix of dysentery, smallpox, and something worse, unknown and unstoppable. One crewman said it was cursed blood from the coast. Another blamed the rain that poured into the hold during the storm. No one dared to clean below deck. They simply threw limes and vinegar-soaked rags down and hoped for the best. The smell was unbearable. Even seasoned sailors gagged when the hatch opened. No doctor sailed aboard Theophilus Chase, only a half-trained cabin boy with a surgeon's kit and a bottle of gin. His hands shook too much to sew, and he bled more people than he healed. The captain gave orders to thin the sick. One by one, the weakest were dragged from below and thrown overboard, still breathing. Some struggled. Some didn't. Mothers screamed. Fathers clenched fists. Children hid behind the shadows of stronger bodies, whispering not to be seen. One enslaved man, barely able to walk, chose to leap overboard himself. His body disappeared beneath the waves without a splash. By now, over 30 had died from illness. And not only among the captives, 3 sailors followed. Their bunkroom reeked of sweat, rum, and death. The first mate demanded daily vinegar washdowns and began sleeping with a pistol beneath his pillow. Still, the disease spread. One enslaved woman, a midwife back in her village, tried to care for the sick. She chewed bitter bark she had hidden in her clothing, mixing it with water to reduce fever. She whispered prayers and rubbed aching joints. For a few, it worked. For most, it didn't. As death piled up, the crew grew more afraid than cruel. They stopped shouting and hitting. They moved with gloves and cloth over their faces. Even the captain appeared less proud, less certain. He stood at the bow more often, silent and unmoving, staring into the endless gray horizon. And below deck, among the moans and quiet sobs, a new kind of silence took hold, not from peace, but from exhaustion. As Theophilus Chase sailed further into the mid-Atlantic, food supplies ran low. The salted meat had spoiled during the storm, and water barrels were fouled with slime. What little remained was rationed, first to the captain and officers, then to the crew. For the enslaved, there was rice boiled in seawater, and sometimes only that. One morning, a young enslaved boy refused to eat. His lips were cracked, his eyes wide with fear. The overseer, a broad-shouldered man named Havers, took it as a challenge. Havers had long enjoyed asserting dominance. Where the captain commanded with cold efficiency, Havers preferred displays of raw power. He had a reputation, "The lash speaks louder than mercy," he often said. He descended into the hold that morning with the cat-o'-nine-tails in hand. The boy was no more than 10, his arms thin as reeds. His mother pleaded in hushed whispers, shielding the child with her body. Havers shoved her aside. Her head struck a beam. She crumpled to the floor. The boy was dragged toward a wooden post. Several others looked away. Some closed their eyes. But there was no silence. The whip cracked through the air, striking flesh and bone. The child shrieked. Suddenly, one of the older men lunged forward. He tackled Havers to the ground, shouting words in his native tongue. It was a suicide act. 2 nearby sailors rushed to help. They beat the man until he stopped moving. Blood pooled under his body. Havers stood again, shaken but still burning with rage. The punishment that followed was not just for the boy or the attacker, it was for everyone. The hatch remained open, and every enslaved person was forced to watch. The boy received 10 lashes. His cries echoed against the ship's wooden ribs. The captain, hearing the noise from above, did not intervene. Afterward, Havers locked the hold and left the boy bleeding beside his unconscious mother. No food was distributed that day. The air in the hold grew colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. Where there had once been whispering and prayers, now there was only the sound of breathing. Long, slow, and strained. Later that night, one of the women, once a singer, hummed a melody from her homeland. It was soft, barely audible. But slowly, others joined. Not in defiance, but in memory. For a few minutes, the darkness was filled with a voice stronger than Havers' whip. Above deck, Havers stood at the bow. A faint tremor shook his hand. He didn't notice it. Though the ocean had calmed, another storm had begun, this one not in the sky, but within minds and spirits. The captives, sick and starved, had started to hallucinate. Some saw loved ones from their villages. Others whispered of spirits walking among them in the darkness. A boy murmured to the wooden wall beside him, believing it to be his father. A woman rocked herself and sang to a baby who had died days earlier, arms empty yet cradling the memory. Sleep brought little relief. Nightmares shook them awake, visions of fire, of drowning, of endless chains. Some began scratching the walls, carving patterns or names with fingernails worn to the quick. One man tore out his hair, convinced he had insects crawling under his scalp. No one stopped him. Not even the others. Not even the guards. The air below deck felt thinner now, as though the ship itself was growing tired of the cries within it. The wood creaked in long, aching groans. Buckets overflowed. Rats were now a constant sight, feeding on scraps, and on what remained of the dead when the crew forgot or refused to remove the bodies quickly. Above deck, the crew was no better. Many were drinking heavily, their eyes sunken, hands trembling. The first mate muttered curses in his sleep, dreaming of shadows with faces. One sailor jumped overboard, shouting that he saw ghosts in the sails. They never found his body. The captain noticed. He issued new orders, music on deck twice daily. A fiddler played at sunrise and sunset. To keep the men's spirits straight, he claimed. But the music only made the silence below deck seem heavier. Joy was not welcome. It felt like an insult. One evening, the midwife woman, her name, whispered by the others, was Amma, stood and raised her voice in prayer. It was not in English. Not in any European tongue. But the rhythm was clear. Each word fell like a drumbeat. Each pause felt like a heartbeat. One by one, others followed. No instruments. Just voices. Even some of the crew, above deck, paused to listen. The sound drifted upward like smoke, low, haunting, beautiful. The captain stood still at the helm, staring toward the horizon, unmoved in body but shaken somewhere deep inside. It was the only time anyone aboard Theophilus Chase, enslaved or free, felt something close to unity. And it didn't last. In the weeks that followed, the Theophilus Chase slipped further into moral darkness. Disease crept through the hold like a silent tide, dysentery, fever, something unnamed that made even the strongest captives tremble with cold under the tropical sun. The crew began tossing bodies overboard more frequently, sometimes without checking if life had fully left the lungs. One enslaved woman was heard coughing in the water before she sank. The captain did not react. Neither did the men. One boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, was small enough to hide inside a food barrel. It had once held dried beans, now empty but for dust. He climbed in during a frenzied moment when crew opened the hatch to remove the dead. No one saw him do it. He curled himself inside the stinking wood and did not move. Hours passed. The hatch slammed shut again. The boy stayed hidden. He didn't know why he hid, perhaps it was fear, perhaps hope. For a time, he slept. When he awoke, he tried to stand, but couldn't. His legs had gone numb. Days passed. He began to whisper stories to himself. About a river. About his mother's song. He forgot where he was. He didn't care. When hunger struck, he chewed a splinter from the barrel wall until his gums bled. Eventually, the smell drew attention. A sailor lifted the lid expecting to find rot, but found the boy instead, barely conscious, mouth stained with blood. He screamed. The captain had the boy removed and brought to the deck, where the sun beat down like judgment. He did not order punishment. Instead, he ordered the boy washed and fed. A strange moment of mercy. But this was not kindness. It was calculation. He's small, the captain told the first mate. Good for house service. We'll get more for him at port. The boy's legs would not move. The ship's surgeon, a drunkard with yellow teeth, declared his lower limbs dead. He suggested throwing the boy overboard. The captain refused. Instead, the child was placed in the corner of the hold, beside a lantern that flickered with sour oil. Other captives cared for him. An old woman tore part of her dress to wrap around his feet. Another fed him with her own portion of rice. For the first time since the voyage began, someone was being protected, not because of strength, but because of helplessness. The boy rarely spoke again. But sometimes, at night, he would hum the river song. Just a single verse. Then silence. After months adrift on the Atlantic, the cry finally came from above, "Land ho!" For the crew, it was a moment of relief, even triumph. The sails were trimmed, the uniforms dusted off. Some men shaved for the first time in weeks. Their boots were cleaned. They moved with new energy, whistling and joking again. But below deck, among the enslaved, the mood was different. Land meant the end of the voyage, but not the end of the nightmare. It meant sail, separation, new chains. For many, it meant a fate even worse than the ship. Some prayed. Others sat silently, backs against the creaking wood, eyes staring into nothing. One man muttered over and over, "Better the sea than the field." The boy from the barrel did not speak. He had stopped humming days ago. Now he only stared at the floor. The old woman beside him braided his hair as gently as if he were her own. Another man sang softly in a dialect no one else recognized. That night, as the ship slowed and coasted toward the harbor, a small group of captives gathered their strength. Whispers passed between them. Eyes flickered in the dim light. They had no weapons. No plan. Only desperation. They tried to force the hatch. Their hands were bloodied before a guard even noticed. A bell rang. Screams echoed. In seconds, it was over. 2 men beaten. 1 woman kicked and left unconscious. The rest were chained again, this time with thicker iron. The captain descended into the hold the next morning. His eyes scanned the damage. Without saying a word, he pointed to 6 people. "These," he said, "go to the first buyer. Unbroken, still spirited. Worth more." He saw not the pain in their eyes, but only the price they might fetch. The harbor city, Charleston, soon appeared on the horizon. Palms swayed in the breeze. White houses gleamed in the sun. The market waited. On deck, some captives were brought up in small groups. Their chains clinked softly as they moved. They blinked at the light, at the world that would now own them. Children cried. Mothers held them tightly until they were forced apart. Men stared at the docks, where ropes and papers waited. The smell of burning sugar hung in the air. The Theophilus Chase, battered but intact, drifted into harbor as smoothly as any merchant vessel. No trace on her hull betrayed the suffering below. No sign marked her decks as a floating prison. She was a ship like any other, except to those who had endured her voyage. And she had one more task to perform. The Theophilus Chase anchored at the wharf in Charleston as the sun climbed higher, throwing gold across the water. Her sails were furled. Her hatches locked. On deck, crewmen lined up the captives like crates, their chains still fastened. There was no shouting. No ceremony. Only the rhythm of commerce. The enslaved were marched off in 2s and 3s, under watchful eyes. Dock workers recorded numbers, not names. Their real names, soft-sung in the forests of West Africa, were gone, replaced with Christian ones scrawled in ledgers: Samuel, Mary, Joshua. The boy from the barrel became Jacob. His legs still wouldn't move. Buyers came with coin and contract. They lifted mouths, checked teeth, prodded limbs, barked in thick accents. Women were separated from men. Children clung to skirts until pulled away. One man was sold to a cotton estate in the backcountry. A girl of 12 went to a rice plantation. The old woman, who had braided hair and wrapped feet, was deemed too old for labor. She was not sold at all. No one knows what became of her. The captain signed papers, received coin. His ship, he told the harbor clerk, would rest for a month before returning to Liverpool. Repairs were needed. Wood warped from the voyage. But the bones of the ship, the ropes, the planks, the name, remained strong. Before sunset, the last of the enslaved had been claimed. The deck was empty, save for a few blood stains and a broken manacle that no one noticed. The captain walked the planks once more. He stopped beside the mast, where the boy had once been washed and weighed. He looked at the sea, then turned and descended below. Below deck, the air was still heavy. Rats scurried between corners. Slaves no longer wept or cried here. Only silence remained. The Theophilus Chase had done her job. She would do it again. Hundreds more would pass through her holds in years to come. Her name would never change. But the names of those she carried? Lost. And yet, scraps would remain. Stories whispered through generations. Marks carved into wood, remembered in lullabies, repeated around fires. Not all voices were silenced. Not completely. Somewhere inland, the boy, Jacob, sat under a tree. His legs still weak. A kind woman brought him water. He watched her face. Her skin was like his. She hummed something unfamiliar. Still, he recognized it. The melody. The rhythm. His mother's song.